Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Welcome to 2026. This is our first episode of the new year, and I want to jump in. We're going to finish. This is the fourth part of our four-part series looking at the question of consciousness. And we have been looking a lot at a book written by a neurosurgeon, Dr. Michael Egnor and Denyse O'Leary. The book is called The Immortal Mind. I strongly recommend it. Really good read. And what we've been talking about in these four episodes is the question of consciousness. And to what does consciousness point us to? You know, all of this began going back to a quote from Richard Dawkins from The God Delusion. I'm not going to rehash that quote again. You can see it in many of the previous episodes, talking about the things that a neo-Darwinian theory of evolution has really struggles to explain. And consciousness ranked right up there on the list, as he was quoting from one of his colleagues' books. He indicated that there were three things that neo-Darwinian evolution had a really difficult time explaining: the jump from lifelessness to life, the complexity of life, and then this question of consciousness. And so we've been looking at that as we go forward. And in the previous three episodes, what we've talked about are looking at this question of if we are more than just a wet robot, if we are more than just the programming that's been put in us by an evolutionary process, then there's things that we would recognize, that we do recognize in our daily lives, that free will is a real thing. If we are simply the product of evolution, then free will is just a myth. Free will doesn't really exist. We would recognize that if we are just merely the product of a neo-Darwinian process, why would we trust what's going on between our ears if we're not actually programmed by an intelligent designer? We've looked at the question, and we started looking at medical evidence. We've defined our terms. We've done a whole bunch of different things. Please go back and look at the last few episodes for more information on this as we go forward. Today, what we're wrapping up today is looking at the last two pieces of medical evidence that point to the existence of the mind, that the mind and the brain are two separate things. And so as we look at this next portion, what we're going to look at, the last two things, are people who suffer severe brain injuries. And then we're going to look at this question of near-death experiences. So let's jump right in and get going. We've got a lot of quotes, a lot of things to look at today. So one of the questions that puzzles scientists, neurosurgeons, and scientists alike is this question of patients who have suffered severe brain injuries or patients who have been born with an enormous portion of their brain missing. And so when you have those situations, if we are nothing more, if the mind and the brain are two separate things, what logic would tell us is if someone is born missing 60% of their brain, then they would be 60% of the same individual we would otherwise go to expect. If the brain and the mind are basically the same thing, then if someone suffers a severe injury to the brain, then we would expect to see a complete change in personality. We would expect to find a different person at the other end. Now, what makes this difficult is that we recognize that there are changes to individuals who have suffered severe traumatic brain injuries. There are limitations to people who have been born and missing a very large portion of their brain. But what you find and what the research tells us, and again, a lot of good information in Dr. Egnor's book, what you find is that these things are not deal breakers, that these things do not have the impact that we would otherwise assume that they would have. So let's jump in and look at this. And he kind of sums it up this way. He says, suppose everybody who lacked a certain part of the brain was disabled in a very specific way. Then the brain would be like a machine. Take out a part and it just doesn't work or work right. Then the idea that the mind is merely the physical functions of the brain, the materialist view, would be hard to argue with. But that's not at all what we see. And he goes on to talk about this. He says, of course, if the brain is seriously damaged, intellect and will can be impaired. But that is because the brain damage impairs memory or perception areas that are needed for the mind to understand what has happened or is happening. So, for example, if you suffer a severe injury, it can absolutely damage your ability to access certain memories within the brain. There's a great movie with Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore called 50 First Dates. Wonderful movie, lots of fun. but it kind of talks about that. It's just mostly a fun movie. Not a lot of science there, but fun movie, and there you go. But what you find in those cases is, even though there's been damage to the brain and it does change who the person is, it doesn't change their consciousness. What's happening is you have a change in the ability of the person to be able to function through the brain because the brain has been damaged. He goes a little bit further and he says, here's the conundrum that these cases pose. On the one hand, a neurosurgeon must be very careful about removing brain tissue that's doing something important. On the other hand, people with very dramatic natural brain losses or absences can have normally functioning minds. If the mind were merely the activities of the brain, that would not be happening. And he goes on to talk about a list of things. And I love this quotation because he talks about this and how this is what we would expect to find, but this isn't what we find at all. He says, looking at this, if the mind is completely a product of the material functions of the brain, then there would be no mental phenomena without brain functions. And we know that that's not true. We're going to talk a lot about that in near-death experiences. As brain function is altered, the mind will be altered. That's also not true. We definitely don't find that. In some cases we do, but it's not across the boards. If the brain is damaged, then mental function will be damaged. And again, that's many cases that's not true. It can be altered, and there can be difficulties, but people who've suffered traumatic brain injuries can live very normal lives, even if they've lost some physical abilities, even if they've lost some memories. Who they are doesn't necessarily change. Brain development will correlate with mental development. That's definitely not true. Some really great examples in here talking about that. And we will be able to correlate brain activity with mental activity, no matter how we choose to look at it. And again, that's just simply not true. There are some correlations, but the correlations are not absolute. And so when you look at someone who's been born missing an enormous portion of the brain, you would expect to look at them. And he talks about one young lady that was the case, that when she was born, he had to tell her parents she was born missing an enormous portion of her brain, and she was probably going to live a life with enormous physical difficulties. And it turned out to be just the opposite. She lived a very normal life. And while that's obviously not always the case, in those situations where it is, if the brain and the mind are the same thing, that makes no sense. And that would not be able to be the case. So because we don't see an absolute relationship between the two, and what he recognizes in all of this is there has to be something more going on. That the mind cannot just be the brain. And we don't see a linear relationship, a one-to-one relationship. Any damage to the brain causes comparable damage to the mind. That's just simply untrue. And while there is sometimes a relationship there, it's not enough of a relationship to be able to conclude that the mind and the brain are still absolutely the same thing. And that's the point that he has in this. Now, the next thing that we really want to look at when we look at this question is near-death experiences, and this is going to be the last topic that we look at when walking through this. And I want to use a case that they talk about in here as kind of a jumping off point and an example. And the case is that of a woman named Pam Reynolds. And he talks at length about that case here in the book. Pam Reynolds in 1991 was diagnosed with a severe aneurysm of her basilar artery, which is just right here. I'm pointing like you can see the back of my head, right at the base of the skull, leading up into the brain. And it was an extremely severe aneurysm. And the problem is, how do you fix the aneurysm without killing her as a patient? And so what they had to do was this incredibly risky surgery where they cooled her body down like into the 60s. And then they took her and they rotated the bed upward. And I'm obviously oversimplifying this tremendously, but they rotated the bed upward, they stopped her heart and drained all of the blood out of her brain. So by every measure that we normally would go on to use, she was brain dead. And I think they had 39 minutes, it said, where they created brain death in her to repair the aneurysm. During that 39 minutes, she had no EEG, no brainstem responses, and no blood flowing to her brain. By every definition of being brain dead, she was brain dead. Now, what's different about this is they did it on purpose. And it was a planned surgery, and what they were able to do when they stood her up, they drained everything out, then they were able to go in and they were able to fix the aneurysm. I mean, it's incredible that we could actually have the technology to do this. And this was clear back in 1991. The interesting development was after the surgery, she's healed successfully, she comes out of it great, but then she starts to go on to describe things that were happening while she was brain dead. Things that she could not possibly have known. And this is one of the questions in these near-death experiences. How is it possible that patients are able to describe these things, whether it is in a near-death experience outside of a surgery room, or if it's in a near-death experience that is inside an operating room in a very controlled environment, where we're able to monitor and know for a fact that the patient is brain dead or disabled to a point during the process where they should not be able to know these things that they know. You know, when it's outside of a hospital and it's an uncontrolled situation, it's on the side of a highway and something has happened and they think the patient is coded and they're able to use the paddles and bring them back, what's different because we don't really exactly know what the real condition of the patient was other than, well, they flatlined and we know they didn't have a heartbeat, but we don't exactly know what was going on between their ears. In this situation, she was brain dead by every measure of medical science. And yet she knew things. The list of things that she knew was remarkable. The surgical instruments that they used on her and the sounds that they made, things that she absolutely did not know before going into surgery. She overheard very specific discussions with a cardiac surgeon in the room who was helping to work on her during the case. And then she recalled, and this is where it's going to get into similarities with other people who have near-death experiences. Then she recalled leaving the room and moving to a realm that would more associate with the afterlife, on her way to heaven, in other words. She saw her deceased grandmother and heard her deceased grandmother calling out to her and other deceased relatives, all of them looking like they were in the peak of good health. They didn't look like her last memories of them. She saw them at that point in their life when they're in their just perfect physical health. And yet somehow she knew that was her grandmother, even though she never knew her grandmother at that age in her life. And all of them had told her during that point that she couldn't continue on any further and that she had to go back. She had to go raise her family. She had things she had to do. And back she went as they brought her body back to life. It is remarkable when you look at the descriptions that people have in these near-death experiences. They're very vivid memories. They describe things that are very similar. They describe conversations that are not in any case unique. They're very similar, but they always often involve relatives, I should say, but it's always someone close to them, always someone who is deceased. In some cases, people that the patient didn't know who was deceased. If all we are is our brain and we are not a mind, then none of these things can be true. Dr. Egnor does a really good job of going through critical defenses of what might be causing these things. And the interesting thing is, none of them make good sense. I love the way he puts it. He says, as Steve Taylor has pointed out in Psychology Today, near-death experiences have never been satisfactorily explained in neurobiological terms. All of these theories of what might be going on to the contrary, have been found to be problematic. One weakness of such explanations is that they try to account specifically for selected aspects of the near-death experiences. Like, for example, well, things that we know happens to somebody who's been deprived of oxygen. Except the problem is what happens to people and the experiences they describe when they've been deprived of oxygen doesn't remotely match the experiences of near-death experiences by people who've seen these things. He continues, he says, but they fail to account for the complete experience. The way they account for the narrow aspect of the NDEs that they focus on invariably conflict with all of the other evidence. That's why no skeptical explanation provides a credible account of NDEs. So what are some of those things and what is he talking about here? So there are core experiences that people describe as having experienced during these events. He says here, that includes a subjective sense of being dead, a feeling of peace, painlessness, pleasantness, and so on, a sense of bodily separation, perhaps a sense of entering a dark region or tunnel, or encountering a presence or hearing a voice. That may include taking stock of one's life, a life review, seeing a bright and often beautiful light or being enveloped in it, seeing beautiful colors, entering the light, and encountering visible spirits. Near-death experiencers frequently report mental conversations with a being in the light or with deceased persons, especially relatives. Those who report undergoing a life review may also report a sense of forgiveness as well as a profound understanding in a world of beauty beyond nature. They get a glimpse into something after this existence. And if that is in fact true, then materialism is absolutely blown out of the water. Clearly, materialism is blown out of the water. And that's why they fight these things. When you look at these experiences, he goes on further, it's our last quote. He says, NDE researchers define these vertical perceptions as, quote, any perception, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, and so on, that a person having experienced during one's NDE, and that is after corroborated as having corresponded to material conscious reality. So again, those experiences that woman had in the surgical room where she could overhear the conversations of people talking about her while she's brain dead. He goes on to say, near-death experiences have been subjected to extensive scientific analysis on this basis over the past half century. In 2009, Janice Holden and her colleagues reported 107 cases in the scientific literature of NDE patients who had vertical experiences involving observations and events that could be corroborated in the way we're describing. Again, that's a deal breaker for materialism. If these patients are able to do that, then there is something outside of us, something that persists after we are gone. And so when you put all of these things together, again, we're looking for the best explanation. We're looking, because I don't think in any of this you can come away with and say, well, that's clearly a silver bullet. That is 100% proof that materialism or naturalism is false and creationism is true. But when we look at the combined overall evidence, and again, I understand why Dawkins' friend basically put this up on the same list of things that materialism simply cannot explain, that are realities of our existence that are not going away. This is not something, again, that is the result of, well, this is something that we used to think 500 years ago, but really we know better now. We're learning these things on the basis of modern scientific evidence. And the further we go, the more we come to realize there is a difference between the mind and the brain. That our consciousness is something outside of just what's going on between our ears, that we are way more than just moist robots. We are something special. And that something special that we see points to the loving hand of a creator. That is the best explanation. And as they talked about in all of this, whether you're looking at the existence of free will, whether you're looking at what happens to patients who have suffered severe brain injuries, whether we're looking at philosophical evidence and looking at the definitions of these things, or whether we're looking at things like the examples of near-death experiences, as we look at all of these things that we've looked at over the last 4 weeks when we've done this journey, when we look at these various things, clearly the best evidence is that of an intelligent creator. Clearly, that's what we're looking at in all of this. And that is going to be, again, this is a deal breaker of a problem for materialism, for naturalists. This is a deal breaker because we know the fact that we can have this debate at all is evidence that we're more than just wet robots. This is evidence that we are something greater. And ironically, we kind of miss that point and we argue using our consciousness to argue against our consciousness, and that we're nothing more than the gray matter between our ears. That is one of the great conundrums in all of this. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. We are going to continue forward in the weeks upcoming, and we're going to look at this question of objective morality and what does objective morality do in all this? How does it help us to better understand who we are? Thank you so much for joining us. If you like this episode, thank you for sticking with it. I hope you enjoyed the whole episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode, the subscribe button for the podcast, for those of you on YouTube. For those of you on iTunes and Spotify, I hope you'll consider following us there. I appreciate you so much for joining us. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to prooftogracee@yahoo.com via email, or you can find helpful information on our website at prooftogracee.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.